All right, welcome to the second part of the social psychology unit. Let's begin. Social psychology is all about how our behavior is affected by social factors. So, social relations is another term that is often used. Social relations refers to, again, how we think of other people. So things like the fundamental attribution error, that's what FAE stands for on the slide there. Remember the fundamental attribution error? That's where we tend to overestimate people's personality factors when we are explaining their behavior. But when we're explaining our own behavior, we tend to uh, overestimate personality dispositions if it's something good. So when we're explaining our own behavior and something good happens, we tend to say, yeah, that's just how I am. I'm really smart. I'm really strong. I'm really fast. I'm really lucky. But if something bad happens, we explain it by the situation. Oh, that's not me. I was just stressed that day. I was late for work. That's why I was kind of a jerk to you. Social relations also refers to how we are influenced by others. So we talked about social facilitation, social loafing, how our performance on a particular task is impacted by the presence of an audience, or whether or not we think we're acting alone or on a team. And we also want to talk about how we behave towards others, not just our thoughts, not just our attitudes, but how we actually behave. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on today: the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, a couple terms to define here. So, from a social psychology standpoint, we want to differentiate between these three terms: prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. They are all closely related, but they mean different things. Start with prejudice. So, prejudice is an unjustifiable negative attitude towards a group. So, let's say you don't like people who wear socks. For some reason, you have prejudice against people who wear socks. It's not justifiable. Socks are totally normal, totally healthy. Sometimes we have to wear them. So, it's unjustifiable and it's a negative attitude towards a particular group of people. Now, a stereotype is a generalized belief about a group. So, going with the socks example, let's say your stereotype about people who wear socks is that they are all criminals. People who wear socks are criminals. That is a generalized belief. So, you see one person wearing socks, and you assume that because they are part of that group, that they fit this generalized belief. And the last one there, discrimination. This is unjustifiable negative behavior towards a group. So, where prejudice is a negative attitude, discrimination is a negative behavior. So, you might go up to someone wearing socks and punch them in the face and steal their purse or steal their wallet. That would be an example of discrimination. Or if you're a store owner, you don't let anyone into your store who is wearing socks. So here we have three related but different terms: prejudice, stereotype, discrimination. Prejudice is a negative attitude, discrimination is a negative behavior, and a stereotype is a generalized belief. Let's talk about prejudice first. Good news: overt prejudice is on the decline. Over the last few decades, our society has seen a pretty steep decline in overt prejudice. So it is it is not okay like it used to be openly racist, openly sexist, and that we have some great examples to show that. Harry and Meghan, the famous royal couple, they are a mixed race couple. And yes, they are definitely taking some flack for being a mixed race couple, but it is no longer okay to give them grief for being a mixed race couple. Um, I'm not exactly watching the recent Netflix show that's coming out, but I hear that is definitely something that they had to deal with in the royal family before they left it. Barack Obama, the very first African American president. So at least half the country was willing to vote for a black man for the highest office in the land. That is another great example of uh, overt prejudice on the decline in this country. And then on the far right there, I've got a graph where it's showing the different generations and their attitudes towards interracial dating. So we've got this faded gray line that represents the silent generation. So that is people born between 1928 and 1946. The baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, they represent this kind of dark filled in teal line. Gen X is this faded green line, and then the millennial generation, that is this dark blue line. And you can see that these lines are steadily going further and further up this graph. So on the y-axis, we have support for interracial dating, 100% down to 20% on this axis. On the x-axis, we have the year, so time, 1987 all the way up to 2009. So you can see that even within a generation, as time passes, support for interracial dating still increases within a generation. But if you look between the generations, from the silent to the boomer to the Gen X to the millennial generation, you see these pretty huge steps up. So looking like, at least according to this graph, the millennial generation has the highest support for interracial dating. I'd say that's somewhere around 93, 94%, somewhere in there. So again, compare that to even in the late 80s with the silent generation, that was sitting right around 40%. So 40% of people in that generation were okay with two people of different races dating. So we've got tons of evidence to show that overt prejudice is on the decline in a very big way in the United States. That's a great thing. Now, let's talk about subtle prejudice. This is a very different story. Subtle prejudice is a lot harder to get rid of. It's a lot more tricky to eradicate. Overt prejudice has a fairly strong relationship with subtle prejudice, but it's harder to quantify. People aren't typically as willing to admit that they have subtle prejudices, and oftentimes people aren't even aware that they have subtle prejudices. They aren't aware that they have negative attitudes that might influence their behavior in small ways. Job selection, this is a great example. We have a lot of good data showing that even if people don't know the race of a candidate for an open position, they will judge that person based on what their name sounds like. And researchers have done this. They've sent out identical resumes to many different job openings. And what they found is that typically white sounding names will often get selected more often than typically black sounding names. Identical resumes, the only thing that's different is the name at the top and the typically white sounding name, like John Smith or something like that, that will get picked more often. So that's an example of subtle prejudice. And we have to talk about the implicit association test. So I've got a short video showing an example of the implicit association test, or the IAT. And it kind of walks you through what the experiment does. It's a pretty simple, pretty short experiment. And what it does is it measures how fast you can associate white names and white faces with good words, and how quickly you can associate white names and faces with bad words. And then it does the same thing for black names and black faces. So it's measuring how quickly you can make an association between a white name or face with typically good words, and it's also measuring how quickly you can make the association between black names and faces also with good words. And it does the same thing with bad words. So bad words would be something like poison or sad, awful, very stereotypically bad types of words. Good words would be things like joy, happy, love, things of that nature. So what it's doing is measuring how you might not even be aware that you're making the associations between white names and faces and typically quote unquote good words, and you're a little slower to make associations between black names and faces with stereotypically good words. So, depending on how quickly you can make those associations, that is, some would argue, a good measure of subtle prejudices, implicit associations. I have a link here also on the course website, this harvard.edu link. This will take you to a place where you can actually take the implicit association test if you are interested in doing that. This is a little controversial. The implicit association test is it came out, it made a big splash in the research literature, and people were pretty impressed by it. But over the last few years, um, it's become a little more controversial. The results might not show what we think they show, but I think it's something worth talking about. It's an interesting idea at the very least. All right, moving on. So let's talk about prejudice and where it comes from. Just like all good psychologists, we like to think about the biopsychosocial model. And since we're talking about social psychology, we're going to focus on the social side of that model for prejudice. So we have something called the in-group bias. And this is a bias where we favor people who are in the same group as us. And group is a very broad term. It can mean many different things. But the smaller the group, the more we favor people who are in that group with us. So people in the same high school, we tend to have a bias towards people within our high school compared to people outside of our high school. Within our own social clique, so if you're part of the jocks or if you're part of the nerds or whatever the cliques are these days, I'm not too well versed on contemporary cliques, but people who are in the same social clique as you, you tend to favor them over people who are outside of your clique. Nationality, political affiliation, we tend to favor people who are in the same groups as us, no matter how you define group. And what I mean by favor is that we tend to think of people in our group as more trustworthy, friendlier, safer. We usually have more empathy towards them, and we don't mind physical contact with them. So, like shaking their hand, patting them on the back, giving a hug, those types of things. And there is some adaptive value to this. The basic idea here is that the familiar is safe. The familiar is something we are used to. If someone is in our group, there's a good chance that they have been vetted in some way. We know them, maybe we think like them, we have lots of similarities with them. They're familiar, they're safe. We don't have to be scared of the unknown. So that's the in-group bias. And we can also talk about social roles. So remember the word schema? A schema is like a framework for knowledge. We have schemas for people, we have schemas for social roles. Schemas help tell us how to behave in a particular social role. You have a schema for being a student. There are certain behavioral expectations that you might place on yourself for how to be a good student, how to interact with your professors, how to interact with other students. You have a schema for maybe you have a job. You have a schema for how to be a good employee, how to interact with other employees, how to interact with your boss or supervisor. We have these scripts or these frameworks that help us behave in those certain ways. Now, one way that this has been documented in a pretty extreme way is between prisoners and guards. Guards, there is definitely a schema that everyone has for what a prison guard is, what they do, who they are, how they should act towards prisoners. And we saw this in a pretty extreme way in Abu Ghraib. And Abu Ghraib was a detention center for people suspected of terrorism over in Iraq, and some pretty horrible offenses occurred there. There was a leak of pictures and videos, and that's the only way that the public was made aware of what was going on there. And it was pretty damning. It was very alarming. There was definitely some torture going on, and it seemed like the guards performing the torture were very much enjoying the act of torturing. Pretty nasty stuff. And a lot of this is based on research that was done decades ago at the University of Stanford. Philip Zimbardo is the famous scientist, the famous psychologist known for this experiment. This is another one of those extremely famous experiments in psychology, in the history of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment. If you've heard of it, great. If you haven't, go ahead and watch this video that's linked on the course website. If you have heard of it, go ahead and watch it again. It's a nice little refresher. There are some slightly distressing scenes in it, so prepare yourself for that. And now there's actually a Hollywood movie made about the Stanford Prison Experiment. Can you believe that? So the basic idea of the Stanford Prison Experiment is that random students at the University of Stanford were randomly assigned. They participated in this experiment, and they were randomly assigned to be either a guard or a prisoner in this fake prison in a psychology laboratory on Stanford's campus. And they had to stop the experiment after just a couple days because some people were experiencing extreme psychological distress, and the guards were actually becoming abusive. And this has become controversial recently because Zimbardo initially said that he did not give the prisoners or the guards any instructions. They simply just started acting in these roles naturally, unsupervised. But some evidence came out recently that Zimbardo actually may have played a pretty heavy hand in making the guards act the way they did. But anyway, it's still something worth talking about, and at the very least, it's a very famous experiment in psychology. Moving on to the psychological side of the biopsychosocial model when it comes to prejudice. And we can talk about the own race bias. Some of you may have heard of this. So the own race bias, this is where we tend to recognize and differentiate faces if they are from our own race. You see that word discrimination there. That's not the right word. That should be changed to differentiation. So we recognize and we can differentiate between faces if they are the same race as us. So if you are white and you're looking at white faces, you can distinguish between those faces easier. If you are black and you're looking at black faces, you can distinguish between those faces better than if you're looking at white faces. If you're Asian, you can distinguish between Asian faces better than you can white faces or black faces. And this own race bias, it emerges very, very early in life. It emerges around infancy. So the first few years of life, very young children start to show evidence of this own race bias. Now, why does this exist? This exists because of mere exposure. We tend to see faces that are similar to ours. Most of our friends are of the same race as us. Now, that's not true across the board, but in most cases, we have friends who are the same race as us. If you're white, you tend to have white friends. If you're black, you tend to have black friends. If you're Asian, you tend to have Asian friends, so on and so forth. So, most of the people that you hang around, friends, family, are from your own race, your same race. So most of the faces that you have experience seeing are from your own race. So it makes sense that you would have the most practice distinguishing between faces of your own race. And we know this is simply a learned behavior because it can be unlearned. If you put people in situation where they see many faces that are not of their own race, then they will start to be better at recognizing and distinguishing between faces of whatever race it is that they are most exposed. So, for example, if you took someone who's white and brought them into a community where there's mostly black people and they started integrating into that community, they would become better at distinguishing between black faces. This is something that solely exists because of who we surround ourselves with. So that's the own race bias. And now I want to talk about another bias or heuristic. And again, we're still talking about the psychological side of that biopsychosocial model of prejudice. So, a thought experiment for you. Are there more words that start with the letter K, or are there more words that have the letter K as their third letter? Take just a minute to think about that. Maybe try to think of some examples. More words that start with K, more words that have K as their third letter. Well, the answer might surprise you because most people would say that there are more words that start with the letter K. But in reality, there are about 3 times as many words that have K as their third letter than there are words that start with the letter K. So what's going on here? This is an example of something called the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is this idea that when we try to think of examples of something, we will recall the most easily remembered examples of that thing. So if you're trying to think of words that have a K in them, it is much easier to think of words that have K as the first letter than it is words that have K as the third letter. Now we can use this availability heuristic to help explain prejudice. Again, we recall the most easily remembered examples of something. So ask yourself, how are certain groups portrayed in the media? What are some of the stereotypes that might be reinforced simply by exposure on news outlets or media outlets? Think about how most Muslims are portrayed in the media today. Oftentimes, we see pictures of angry Muslims yelling in the street, waving a machete, or have an AK-47 strapped on their back. These are some scenes that we've definitely seen out of Afghanistan, or even, well, not as recently, but Iraq. So if that is the example of a Muslim that you are most exposed to when you think about Muslims, that is probably going to influence what you think of. If the most easily remembered example you have of a Muslim is an angry person, maybe burning an American flag on a city street with an AK-47 strapped to their back, that is probably going to influence how you think about Muslims as a whole. When in reality, the vast majority of Muslims on this planet are very peaceful. They're not walking around with guns strapped to their back. They're not burning flags in the middle of the street. They're not angrily yelling for someone's head to be removed, things of that nature. But that doesn't make the news. People living peaceful, quiet lives don't get on the news on a nightly basis. Excuse me. And there's many, many examples of that for different groups out there. All right, so, excuse me. Let's talk a little bit about aggression. And aggression is unfortunately a very common way that we interact with other people. Acting aggressively is probably one of the uh, man, I would hate to say that it's one of the most common ways that humans interact with each other, but it is definitely something that happens far too often. So, the biology of aggression. Let's start with the bio part of the biopsychosocial model. How do we explain aggression from a biology standpoint? Well, we have to talk about the prefrontal cortex. It plays an immensely important role in controlling our behavior. It's almost like we have this tug of war going on between the prefrontal cortex and our limbic system. Remember the limbic system? It's an older part of the brain. It controls emotional processing. It's kind of reflexive, it's unconscious. It gives us those really powerful emotions like love or anger or happiness. A lot of emotional processing is contained within the limbic system. Now, the prefrontal cortex kind of acts like a buffer or a filter on the limbic system. So, the limbic system, it's kind of like the id in Freud's model. It's telling you to go, 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 do this thing, do this thing. Oh, that person pissed you off. Go ahead and punch him in the face. The prefrontal cortex says, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't want to punch that person in the face. They didn't mean to bump into you. That was an accident. If you punch them in the face, then you're going to start a fight. You might go to jail. That's obviously not something that we want to have happen. Let's just move on with our life. So the prefrontal cortex kind of acts as a way to rein in the limbic system. Now, if you damage the prefrontal cortex, then you no longer have that filter. You no longer have the ability to rein in your limbic system. This was the case with Phineas Gage. Remember him from an earlier lecture. This man had his prefrontal cortex destroyed in a railroad accident. That railroad spike was lodged up through his skull and completely destroyed his prefrontal cortex. People said after he suffered that damage to his prefrontal cortex, he was a very different person. He swore, he didn't go to church, he gambled, he drank, he was going to brothels. So it seems like in that tug of war going on in Phineas Gage's head, the limbic system no longer had any competition. So when we're talking about aggression, specifically the biology of aggression, we have to talk about the prefrontal cortex and how it sort of limits our aggressive behavior. And let's see here. How are we doing on time? Got a couple minutes here. I'm going to try to get through this slide and then we'll end this video right up against our 30-minute time limit. So there's some wonderful research done in the late 90s by a research team led by Dr. Rain, and they put murderers, people convicted of murder, and they put them into, I believe it was an fMRI. And in the fMRI machine, they were simply looking at the activity level, the baseline activity level in the patient's limbic system and their prefrontal cortex. What he found was differences between what he called impulsive murderers, so people who committed crimes of passion, maybe they got in a bar fight and killed someone, and premeditated murderers. These are people who may have killed in cold blood. They were planning to commit this murder for a long time. They thought of an escape route, they thought of a weapon, how to hide the weapon. So those are your premeditated murderers. Your impulsive murderers were the ones who just, again, they acted impulsively. In that fMRI machine, they found that the impulsive murderers had a greater limbic system baseline activity. So remember, the limbic system gives them that emotional responses to things. So they've got stronger emotional responses. But in their prefrontal cortex, there was less prefrontal cortex activity compared to the normal population. So they've got this emotional engine pushing them along, but they don't have the prefrontal cortex to rein them in. Premeditated murderers also saw greater limbic system activity, so they've got that emotional engine, but their prefrontal cortex was functioning just like the normal average population. So the prefrontal cortex was working and allowed them to sort of plan ahead. So takeaway message here, both groups showed greater innate aggression, greater baseline aggression from the limbic system. One of them had a functioning prefrontal cortex to rein it in and help plan. One did not and was more impulsive. All right, I'm going to have to end it there because I think I'm right up against my time.